In the lowest area of the farm, there is a natural spring. It's been there for countless years, long before Mom and Dad purchased the farm in 1941. There's a fence around it, and I keep a screen over the opening to prevent a lot of leaves and other debris from falling into the water. Whoever initially dug out the spring lined it with rock part way down. That opening has remained the same as long as I've been associated with the farm. When the water hasn't been disturbed, it's very cold to the touch and even to the feet. The spring was a consistent source of water, even during the driest months of the year. An old hand-crank pump was used to bring water up from the spring and into two old clawfoot bathtubs so that our cattle and horses always had plenty to drink, especially if the creeks were dry. The pump utilized a continuous loop of chain as well as a pipe, both of which were into the water of the spring. As the crank was turned, the chain would come up the pipe and the water would be held in the pipe between each of the suckers that were placed about 2 feet apart. When the water reached the level of the spout, it would flow out into whatever was there to catch it. These hand crank pumps are still available today. In these pictures you can see a close-up of the crank as well as the sprocket that's used to carry the chain around. And there's also a good view of what one of the suckers looks like. Water isn't the only thing that flows into the spring. Clay is also carried in, and that clay gradually builds up inside the spring. And when we were using a pump to water our animals, eventually the clay would make it difficult for us to operate the pump, so it's necessary to dig that clay out so that you could have easy use of the pump. And so typically on the hottest day of the summer, we'd hear our father say, "It's time to clean out the spring." The process of cleaning out the spring was relatively simple but very labor intensive. We first would take the pump out of the spring, and then using an auger style post hole digger and various lengths of steel pipe, you would place the auger into the spring, turn it a few times, and pull up the auger and the pipe, knock out the clay, and put it back into the spring, and continue the process for as long as it would take to get down to the bottom of the spring so that the pump could freely operate.
Just have to rest a little bit.
The work of digging out the clay causes the water in the spring to be stirred up quite a bit, and it takes several days for the clay that remains to settle out of the water and for the water to become clear again. If it appears that I'm working hard to pull up the clay, well, I really am. The clay is heavy. There's a tremendous amount of suction. The length of pipe attached to the auger makes it a very awkward piece of equipment to maneuver, and it takes a lot of energy. I estimate that I bring up 300 to 400 pounds of clay in the process of cleaning out the spring.
Oh.
We never made any use of the clay when I was growing up on the farm, but in later years I became aware that it is a high quality clay, and when it's properly processed it can be used to make beautiful pottery. I've had elementary and secondary school students out to the farm to have the experience of digging raw clay with my assistance and then taking the clay back to their schools where they could process it and then ultimately create ceramic pieces. Cleaning out the spring was, and still is, a dirty, wet, messy chore, and one that Brother Wes and I never looked forward to when we were growing up. The pump's long gone from the spring, but I still feel the need to periodically remove the clay to maintain the flow of water from this natural source. And I'd like to believe that a future caretaker of the land might wish to make use of the spring in much the same way as my family did decades ago.